By Danwei, the people inside this Austrian castle were supposed to be erased. No prisoners, no witnesses, no survivors, and no questions left for the Allies to ask after the war ended. And the only reason that didn't happen is because a German officer decided, in the final days of Hitler's Reich, that the SS was more dangerous than the Americans, more dangerous than surrender, and more dangerous than treason. He would gamble his life on a handshake with the enemy. And before the next sunrise, German soldiers and American soldiers would be firing from the same walls, defending the same gate, and trying to keep a group of high-profile prisoners from being executed in the last most chaotic week of World War II. This story is often told as a strange footnote, an impossible alliance, a last battle, a curiosity at the end of the war. But if you strip away the novelty, what's left is a brutal decision-driven reality, a collapsing empire, a fanatical force that refuses to stop killing, and a few men forced to choose between procedure and speed, between ideology and survival, between waiting for orders and acting without permission. And the most important choice wasn't made in a bunker in Berlin. It was made on a mountain road, by a man who knew the SS would shoot him in the back the moment they realized what he was doing. The castle was Itter, a medieval fortress perched above a small village in the Tyrolean Alps. For most of the war, it had been quiet and controlled, a place the Nazis repurposed into a special prison for valuable captives, French political leaders, generals, and symbols who could be used as bargaining chips, propaganda tools, or hostages. These weren't ordinary prisoners. They were names that mattered, faces that had appeared in newspapers, men whose survival or death could send messages far beyond a single valley. And by 1945, as the Reich shrank and the Allies closed in, those prisoners became something else, living evidence. Witnesses who could tell the world what they had seen, what they had heard, and what the SS was capable of when it believed no one would hold it accountable. That shift, hostages to witnesses, changed the SS calculation. Leverage can be negotiated. Witnesses can only be silenced. And in the last weeks, the SS issued orders across the collapsing front. Do not let important prisoners fall into Allied hands. Destroy records. Destroy facilities. Destroy people. Make the end clean, even if the war itself was ending in ruins. The prisoners at Itter didn't get the official text of those orders, but they lived inside the atmosphere created by them. Rumors of massacres, whispers of evacuation, the sickening pattern that camps were being emptied and prisoners were being marched into the mountains, not toward freedom but toward disappearance. They had heard enough to know that the most dangerous moment in captivity is not the middle of a war. It's the end of one. Because the end creates panic. Panic creates shortcuts. And shortcuts kill prisoners. Then came the moment that should have been a relief and became a countdown. The guards vanished. One day the watchtowers were occupied. The next morning, they were empty. The gate was no longer controlled. The routine that had defined their confinement simply stopped. No commands. No roll calls. No footsteps. At first it felt like the Reich had finally cracked. For a few minutes, men who had lived under years of orders and surveillance could imagine the impossible. Maybe the SS had run. Maybe the prison was abandoned. Maybe they were free. But freedom without protection is a trap. Outside the castle, the region was still crawling with armed men, Waffen-SS units, fragments of formations, roving patrols, death squads hunting deserters, and fanatics who refused to accept that Germany was losing. In those final days, the SS didn't behave like a retreating army. It behaved like an instrument of internal terror, shooting anyone who talked about surrender, executing those who tried to blend into civilian crowds, and punishing traitors to the Reich with a fury that only grows when defeat becomes undeniable. The prisoners at Itter were not safe because the guards were gone. They were in more danger than ever because the guards were gone. The walls that had kept them trapped were now the only thing between them and an execution squad. They were free inside the castle. Outside the castle, they were surrounded by a war that had stopped being organized. And in chaos, the strongest force isn't always the largest. Sometimes it's the most ruthless. The prisoners held a quick, grim council. Their problem wasn't philosophy. It was time. They didn't need to understand the SS. They needed to beat it to the next move. They needed American troops to reach the castle before the SS returned with orders to kill everyone and burn the place down. But how do you contact the Americans in the Alps in 1945 when roads are full of checkpoints, uniforms are lethal, and you're a famous prisoner whose face could get you shot on sight? The VIPs were too recognizable. A former prime minister stopped by an SS patrol wouldn't be questioned. He'd be taken, displayed, or executed. Elderly generals could barely climb stairs, much less outrun armed men. Even if they made it down the mountain, their bodies weren't built for the terrain, and their identities were a death sentence. They needed someone invisible. And in the castle, invisibility belonged to one of the least powerful people present, a young forced laborer from Yugoslavia who had been taken from his home and put to work around the castle doing repairs and hauling supplies, useful enough to keep alive, insignificant enough to ignore. His name was Zvonimir Kukovic. He wore civilian clothing. He had no high-profile documents. He could plausibly be just another displaced person trying to survive the collapse. If a patrol stopped him, he had a chance, small but real, to talk, to lie, to run, to be dismissed. The prisoners didn't ask him with dramatic speeches. They asked him because he was the only option that wasn't automatically doomed. They scribbled a note. The wording didn't need to be poetic. It needed to be understood. Important prisoners at Castle Itter. SS threat. Rescue needed. Kukovic tucked the paper into his clothes and walked out the gate into a world where the wrong accent could get him killed. And as he disappeared into the forest, another man made his own decision to go for help, quietly, without consultation, because he understood something else. If the plan relied on one messenger surviving, it was already fragile. This second man was the castle cook, an Austrian named Andreas Krobot. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a soldier. He was a man who had been feeding prisoners and guards for years, walking into the village for supplies, hearing locals whisper about troop movements, deserters, and the shifting balance of power.
And in that village gossip was a name spoken carefully, the way you speak a name that can get you killed if it is overheard. Major Joseph Gangl. Gangl was a Wehrmacht officer stationed nearby. Not SS, not a party apparatchik. A career soldier in an army that had served Hitler's war machine, but by the last weeks, he was operating under a new and dangerous reality. The Reich was collapsing and the SS was turning its guns inward. In those final days, the SS wasn't just fighting the Allies. It was policing Germany's own surrender, executing anyone who suggested stopping, and hunting soldiers who tried to protect civilians rather than die pointlessly. Gangl had seen enough to understand what final orders looked like. He had also seen enough to recognize the SS as a direct threat to ordinary Austrians in his area civilians, who would be caught in the crossfire, used as shields, or killed as punishment. This is where the title's his promise becomes more precise. Gangl didn't betray Hitler in a cinematic ideological conversion. He made a tactical and moral decision under pressure. He would not die for a lost cause, and he would not let the SS commit more murders in the final hours just to keep control of the narrative. Krobot found him and delivered the situation fast. The castle, the prisoners, the vanished guards, the SS threat. Gangl didn't respond with speeches. He responded with questions. How many prisoners? How many exits? How much time? Because questions tell you whether a man is still debating or already calculating. Gangl was calculating. And then he made the kind of decision that takes you past the point of return. He would go to the Americans. He would ask the enemy for help. Not tomorrow. Not after paperwork. Now. Because if an SS unit returned to Itter, it would not negotiate. It would execute. And once that happened, no apology and no after-action report would bring those people back. Meanwhile, Kukovic was running his own race against time. The Alps are beautiful in photographs. They are unforgiving when you're moving fast with armed men between you and survival. He avoided the main roads. He moved through forests and along paths he had learned over years of forced labor runs. He listened for voices. He flattened into undergrowth when he heard boots. He crossed streams, climbed ridges, and kept moving even when his lungs burned, because stopping meant being caught. Every minute mattered. And every minute he wasn't dead was another minute the prisoners still had a chance. By afternoon, exhausted and filthy, he reached American lines near Innsbruck and tried to make himself understood. To American soldiers, a breathless man with a scrap of paper could be a refugee, a spy, a trap, or a miracle. In war, you don't assume miracle. But the message went up the chain because it was specific enough to be checked and urgent enough to be dangerous if ignored. It reached Captain John Jack Lee, a U.S. Army tank commander with the 12th Armored Division. Lee was not a man searching for romance at the end of the war. He was a man who had spent years watching Germans kill Americans and Americans kill Germans, and he knew that the last week of a war can be as deadly as the first. Rumors are everywhere. Traps are everywhere. Desperation makes people unpredictable. Now he was being told that French VIP prisoners were trapped in a castle, that the SS might be coming to execute them, and that a German officer wanted to cooperate. And the German officer Gangl was on his way to make the same pitch through a different channel. The meeting between Lee and Gangl wasn't staged like a clean diplomatic handshake. It was a tense, cautious encounter on a forest road with armed men watching each other like coiled springs. One side wore American olive drab. The other wore German field gray. Fingers were near triggers. Trust wasn't a currency anyone was spending freely. Lee had every reason to suspect deception. Gangl had every reason to suspect he'd be shot on sight. But both men were pushed by the same constraint: time. The prisoners might not survive the night. Gangl offered the only things he had that were valuable in that moment: local knowledge of roads and SS activity, and German soldiers willing to fight the SS long enough to hold the castle. Lee's mind went to the obvious questions. Why should I trust you? How do I know this isn't an ambush? Why shouldn't I wait for a larger force? And those were smart questions. But smart questions can get people killed when the clock is too tight. Gangl didn't answer with morality. He answered with risk. He explained what he had already done: helping resistance elements, protecting civilians, defying SS pressure, because those actions had consequences. If he were lying, he was still standing in front of Americans in uniform, risking execution from both sides. He was already burning his bridges. And then Lee faced the commander as nightmare choice: wait for reinforcements and risk arriving too late, or move now with a small force and risk being outnumbered or trapped. He chose speed. That choice is what turns this story from strange to inevitable. Because in the last days of the war, speed was the only antidote to SS brutality. A large, well-planned rescue would take time. Time was the one resource the prisoners didn't have. So Lee agreed to go. Not with a regiment. Not with a grand column. With what he could move quickly. One Sherman tank, a small group of American soldiers, and whatever German troops Gangl could muster. That decision created an alliance that wasn't based on forgiveness or friendship. It was based on overlapping survival needs. Lee wanted the prisoners alive, and the SS stopped. Gangl wanted civilians protected, the SS contained, and a path to surrender that didn't end with him being executed as a traitor. Now they had to do the hardest part: travel through chaos. In movies, the road to the target is suspenseful music and a few cutaways. In reality, it's a slow sequence of problems that can kill you in boring ways. A fallen tree that blocks a narrow road. A delay while you clear it, listening for engines that might belong to SS patrols. A rumor of a checkpoint ahead. A civilian cart on the road that forces you to slow down. Every minute of delay is another chance for the SS to reach the castle first. The Sherman's engine noise made stealth impossible. The best they could do was move in the gaps created by a collapsing front units disintegrating, chains of command failing, patrols unsure whether to fight or flee. And that uncertainty was the thin margin the convoy depended on. They pushed forward as dusk turned into darkness, because darkness reduced visibility for attackers, but also made ambush easier. On that road, every shadow could hide a machine gun. Every farmhouse could hold a desperate SS squad. Every curve could reveal a checkpoint. And every man in the convoy knew the same ugly truth. If they were stopped by SS troops, the German soldiers with Gangl might be shot as traitors, and the Americans might be shot as Americans, and the prisoners in the castle would die anyway. The convoy's mission wasn't just rescue. It was a race against discovery, and they made it barely. Near midnight, Castle Itter appeared on its ridge. the outline of medieval stone against a darker sky. From below, it didn't look like a prison or a battlefield. It looked like something from another century, a relic. But inside those walls, the prisoners were listening for engines, listening for boots, listening for anything that would tell them whether help was coming or death was arriving. Gangle approached the gate first. Not because he was heroic, but because if there were still German guards or SS scouts, his presence might buy a few seconds before bullets started flying. The gate opened. The prisoners emerged, stunned to see Germans riding with Americans. And then Lee Sherman rolled into the courtyard, its tracks clanking over stone, a sound so loud and so unmistakable that it was both a relief and a warning. Because now the castle contained a prize the SS would notice. An American tank, American soldiers, German soldiers who were clearly not fighting the Americans, and French prisoners who were supposed to be kept out of Allied hands. If the SS was anywhere nearby, it would come, and it wouldn't come politely. For a brief moment, the rescue felt complete. The prisoners were alive. The Americans were inside the walls. The Germans had switched sides in practice, and then someone checked the time. It was around 4 o'clock a.m. That's when the second act of the night revealed itself. They weren't done. They were trapped. Dawn was only a couple of hours away, and sunrise in the mountains isn't gentle. It turns silhouettes into targets. It turns a hidden courtyard into a visible beacon. At dawn, any SS unit in the valley would be able to see the castle ridge and understand immediately what happened. The prisoners were being taken, and there was an American presence. If the SS wanted to prevent that, it had one option: attack fast and hard before reinforcements could arrive. So the defenders had to make a new plan on a shrinking clock. Do they attempt to evacuate immediately, risking ambushes on the road? Do they hold inside the castle, gambling that reinforcements can reach them before the SS overwhelms them? Do they split forces, sending a messenger for help while preparing defenses? There was no perfect answer, but there was an answer forced by terrain. The defenders had limited men, limited supplies, and a castle that was strong in some ways and vulnerable in others. Imagine this: the final days of World War II in Europe. The Third Reich is crumbling, and chaos reigns. In the middle of the Austrian Alps, a medieval castle becomes the stage for one of the most bizarre and unlikely battles of the entire war. This is the story of the battle for Castle Itter, where American soldiers and German Wehrmacht soldiers fought side by side. Just days before Germany's final surrender in May 1945, a strange alliance was forged. Inside the walls of the 13th century Castle Itter, a group of high-profile French prisoners were being held captive. These weren't ordinary prisoners of war. They were political figures, former prime ministers, a tennis star, and even the sister of General Charles de Gaulle. They had been imprisoned by the SS, and as the war machine collapsed, their lives hung in the balance. The fanatical SS troops in the area had orders to execute them all. The castle's commander had fled, and the prisoners were left in a terrifying limbo. Seeing the writing on the wall, some of the German guards decided to switch sides. One of them, Kurt Siegfried Schrader, a decorated but disillusioned SS officer, made contact with the Austrian resistance. He knew that if the SS returned, it would be a massacre. Meanwhile, a German army officer, Major Joseph Sepp Gangle, was also having a crisis of conscience. He was a veteran of the Eastern Front, a man who had seen the horrors of the Nazi regime firsthand. He had defied orders to fight to the last man and was instead working with local resistance, fighters to protect the nearby town from the retreating and increasingly brutal SS forces. The prisoners at Castle Itter knew they needed help, and fast. They sent their cook, a brave Yugoslav handyman named Zvonimir Kokovic, on a perilous journey to find Allied forces. He biked for miles through hostile territory, eventually stumbling upon an American reconnaissance unit from the 12th Armored Division. The man in charge was Captain John Jack Lay, Jr. Captain Lay, a tough, no-nonsense tanker, was initially skeptical. A German major asking for help to defend a castle full of French VIPs? It sounded like a trap, but Major Gangel was sincere. He offered his men, his knowledge of the local terrain, and his unwavering commitment to defy the SS and protect the prisoners. Lee, recognizing the desperation and the potential truth in the story, made a bold decision. Against orders, he took a small force, just his tank, Basat and Jenny, and a handful of soldiers, and headed for the castle. When they arrived, the scene was surreal. American Gs were greeted by German Wehrmacht soldiers, not as enemies, but as allies. Together, they began to fortify the medieval fortress. They had Captain Lee's single Sherman tank, Major Gangel's small contingent of German soldiers who had renounced the Nazi cause, and the French prisoners themselves, some of whom were former military leaders and were ready to fight. It was a motley crew, a band of brothers united by a common enemy, the Waffen-SS. They didn't have to wait long. As dusk fell on May 4th, the SS began their assault. The 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, a battle-hardened and fanatical unit, surrounded the castle and unleashed a storm of machine gun fire, anti-tank rockets, and 88mm cannon shells. The fighting was ferocious. The defenders were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. Captain Lee positioned his Sherman tank, Basat and Jenny, at the main gate, where it became a crucial defensive strongpoint, but it was also a prime target. An 88mm shell slammed into the tank, destroying it and setting it ablaze, but not before it had repelled the initial SS push. Now, the defenders were truly isolated, their heaviest weapon gone. Inside the castle, the battle raged. American and German soldiers fired from the ancient battlements, covering each other's backs. Bullets ricocheted off stone walls that had stood for centuries. The French prisoners, including former Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, took up arms and joined the defense. The famous tennis player Jean Barotra vaulted from window to window, acting as a runner, relaying messages and ammunition under heavy fire. Amidst the chaos, acts of incredible bravery unfolded. Major Gangel, the German officer who had started this unlikely alliance, was a constant presence on the front lines, directing his men and encouraging the defenders. He saw that Paul Reynaud, the former French premier, was exposed to sniper fire. Without a second thought, Gangel leaped to push him out of the way. In that instant, a sniper's bullet struck Major Gangel, killing him instantly. He died a hero, saving the life of a man who was once his nation's enemy. His sacrifice cemented the bond between the strange allies fighting for their lives. All through the night and into the next morning, the small garrison held on. Their ammunition was running dangerously low. The SS were preparing for a final, overwhelming assault to breach the walls. It seemed like their luck had finally run out. Captain Lee knew they couldn't last much longer. Hope was fading. But then, just as the SS began their final push, the sound of rumbling engines echoed through the valley. It wasn't the SS. It was the cavalry. A relief force from the American 142nd Infantry Regiment, alerted to the desperate situation by Jean Barotra, who had daringly escaped the castle to guide them, had arrived. The sight of American tanks and infantry streaming towards the castle broke the SS. After a brief but intense firefight, the attackers scattered and fled into the woods. The siege was over. The battle for Castle Itter, the only known battle where American and German troops fought on the same side in World War II, had ended in a miraculous victory. The exhausted defenders, American, German, and French, emerged from the smoke-filled castle. They had survived against all odds. Captain Lee was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership and bravery. Major Joseph Gangel was posthumously honored as a hero of the Austrian resistance. His sacrifice stands as a powerful testament to the idea that even in the darkest of times, individual conscience and honor can triumph over ideology. The story of Castle Itter is more than just a strange footnote in history. It's a profound reminder that war is not always black and white. It shows that even in the midst of unimaginable conflict, humanity can shine through. It's a story about choosing what is right over what is easy, about finding common ground with an enemy to face a greater evil. In the final, chaotic hours of a world war, a small group of soldiers from opposing armies chose to stand together, not for a flag or a nation, but for human life. Thank you for watching. If you found this story as incredible as we did, please hit that like button. Subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories from history, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'll see you in the next one.